Hey everyone, Matt here. Welcome to the next episode of Inspired By, where Yugs and myself recreate concepts from various media in the Unreal Engine. In this installment, I'm creating a Boulder stage like the ones in Crash Bandicoot. You know, the ones where Crash is running away from a boulder and has to avoid obstacles like mines, electric fences, and nitro boxes. So let's get right into how I made it. I knew from the beginning that the camera would be the most difficult part of creating this prototype, so that's where I started. The camera needed to meet various different criteria to be true to Crash Bandicoot and work with the stage. It would need to be ahead of the player at all times and look back at the player, but would also need to be able to twist with the course. Plus, no matter how far to the left or right the player is, it's always centered along the stage. To achieve this, I opted to use a spline. With a spline, I was able to create a track of points along the center of the course that the camera could follow. Using a method I found online, which will be linked in the description, I grabbed the distance along the spline closest to the player's location, then moved forward down the spline a certain distance to grab the camera position, setting its rotation to look back at the spline position closest to the player. Originally, this didn't look the best along curves because it had a very jarring snapping effect, but I solved that by adding easing to the camera's rotation and position. Using the basics of the camera spline system, I also factor in the player's distance along the spline for controls. Because I always want the player running toward or away from the camera, I use the forward vector along the spline to adjust the player's direction when hitting the up and down buttons. I do the same for pressing left and right, only using the right vector along the spline instead. The rock also uses the spline as a track to determine its direction. I determine the direction of the spline at the closest location to the rock, then set the rock's velocity and rotation to match that direction. To give the rock the rolling effect, I simply adjust the rotation's Y value. Finally, I use line traces to determine the rock's height. Yeah, so you'll want to use easing for that as well, and make sure that you're using proper distances for your line traces. For the rock, I have two colliders created. The rock starts out not moving, but once the player enters the first collider, the rock is activated and starts moving. When the rock hits the second collider, it stops moving. Because a lot of the obstacles will have similar effects, I decided to have a generic obstacle blueprint with a function that handles interacting with the player by determining if the player is close enough to be damaged to the object and either killing the player or stunning them depending on settings. I then created the mine and nitro based off of that by having it activated after delay upon the player tripping a collider attached to the blueprint. The fence, however, immediately calls that function upon the player entering that collider. For each pit, I had an invisible box that generated overlap events to kill the player that was set to overlap only upon, so that the line traces for the rock would work, but the player could fall through them. I then positioned them to match the surrounding terrain height. Perfect! Okay. So I had an invisible box that did not generate overlap events but was set to overlap only upon, and a separate collider underneath that killed the player. Okay, now it's perfect. Next up is the Wumpa fruits? I'm just going to call them apples. The basics of this are simple. Just have an overlap event for picking them up. But I wanted to replicate the 3D spinning UI look of Crash. For this, I had an apple floating out in the middle of nowhere with a scene capture component 2D set to only show static meshes, which output to a render target, which then goes into a UI material that takes out the black background. For the stage, I used Unreal's landscape functionality to have a course that went downhill and used all the obstacles. To add a bit of extra polish, I also added sound effects for running, the rock, and all of the obstacles. With all that done, let's take a look at the full final product. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Inspired By. For all of the references and resources that I used in this prototype, you can check out the description below. If you enjoyed the video, please help us out by giving the video a like and hit the subscribe button and bell icon to get notifications for when we release new videos. You can also follow our Twitter account @noble_phantom to get clips of upcoming episodes. Until next time, stay safe. See you next video.